Hello and welcome to Happy Hours with me. I am Eileen Cook, and today is, actually I should double check this, June 26th. So welcome to everybody. I am responding today to a question that came in. And again, a reminder, you can send any questions you might have onto our Happy Hour website within the membership section. And I'm happy to do that. Or of course, you can always email me as well. And this email came in talking about timelines. So how do you manage time within a book? So first off, you have to decide what kind of time frame occurs in your book. So what you might see is a wide range of things. So there's everything from, if anyone has read the book The Dinner by Hermann Koch, he's a German writer, I believe, translated into English. That entire novel takes place over the course of one meal. So it's two couples getting together to talk about their child and what their children have been up to, and it's no good. But the actual book is, of course, just over one meal. And then you can look at something like Sarum, which takes place over hundreds of years. So it's generation after generation that are in that book. And it's sort of the tale of London and England broken down by those different things. So when you're talking about one dinner or centuries, how do you manage that? So let's talk about it. So the first off, it depends how you want to tackle your writing. Are you a plotter or are you a pantser? So plotters are probably going to spend some amount of time before they even start writing, thinking about the time frame of the book and when they want key events to happen. So if, for example, you're writing a book that takes place during the school year, you can probably target certain things to basic holidays. So there's going to be September, there's going to be Halloween, which is going to be a big deal in any school, of course. There's going to be Thanksgiving, and then, of course, there will be the Christmas break. So you can start looking at how you want to set things up along in that timeline. Now, if you're a pantser, you're probably just writing the story and it's taking you as it goes. So don't worry about it until the end. But at some point, you have to sit down and make sure you got the timeline correct. So how to do that? So I've seen it done a number of different ways. I've seen people do it where they're keeping a list, kind of almost in essence a timeline from start to finish. So they're doing that kind of thing. And I've also seen it done in Excel spreadsheets where people are doing things like column 1 would be chapter 1. Then there would be a short summary of what's in that chapter. And then the next thing over would be a day or a time so that they have a clear sense of when that chapter is occurring. What you want to, of course, avoid is having something where a character says, boy, I'm sure nervous about that test coming up on Tuesday. Lucky for us, it's only Sunday. And then the next chapter says, the next morning, Eileen got up ready to take the test, because the reader will be like, wait a minute, it should only be Monday. And those are the kinds of details that can sometimes get lost and or changed as you're revising and switching the book. So doing some kind of timeline, some kind of spreadsheet can be helpful in order to sort of help you figure out when do you want those things to occur. Now, one thing that I actually quite enjoy, and I will put a link to this into the notes, is I enjoy downloading those blank calendar pages. So you probably remember these if you've ever had them at work or so forth, but it's basically, you can get them for a week or for a month. I download them and I start filling in when events in my book happen. So I can sort of keep track of what is happening and when. So you'll need some system for that. So the second question is, how do you deal with the transition of time? And let's kind of break that into two different areas: when you're dealing with big chunks of transition and when you might be dealing with smaller chunks. So let's tackle big things first. If you want to have a significant gap, and by significant, I'm kind of going with several months to 6 months to 20 years, then you need some kind of way of making sure the reader is making that leap with you, because it's significant enough that they're going to be confused if you don't have some way to do that. So how to do that? So what you may see is some books are actually divided up the actual structure of the book. So the book may come, for example, in 4 sections, and the sections might be something like winter, spring, summer, fall. that type of thing. You might also see a book that is, chunked into sections in terms of clearly delineating, this is 1970, this is 2017. So you want to show that I'm writing about the character when they are a child, and then I'm flashing forward to when they're much older. You definitely want to have some kind of clear and distinct break. So what you want to avoid is having something where suddenly in the middle of the chapter, you're flashing forward by a significant amount of time. You're going to want to have, at minimum, a chapter break that's happening there. With that kind of significant chunk and change, you might also consider having a very specific thing that says, for example, 6 months later. I'm going to pause this for just a second to let the dog out. All right, dogs have been addressed. So as I was saying, you're going to want to have some kind of clear break. So for example, having a very clear delineation that says 6 months later, or perhaps the actual timeline. So April and the year, or so forth, or no year if you're trying to just make it a general timeline. But something that for the reader, there is a clarity. If you can, also pull that in your setting and sensory details. So if the initial chapter is opening in the fall, make sure you're mentioning lots of things about the leaves crunching, pumpkin spice lattes at Starbucks, the details that will sort of ground people that it is fall. And then if you want to flash forward, again, make sure those sensory details are showing that time passage. So if you're now flashing forward and it's June, maybe you have your character unpeeling themselves from a sticky hot car seat, and trying to kind of front load those early in the chapter so that the reader is jarred again and suddenly remembers, oh, right, a lot of time has passed. It's no longer fall. We've moved into the summer months. So something like that can sort of help move that. Again, another reference that works really well is holidays. So thinking about whether or not you want to make it clear from the holidays what sort of time it is. Anytime you start talking about Christmas trees, carols on the radio, all those kinds of things, people are going to know we're in the month of December. And if the chapter before you were talking about Halloween decorations, people will be very clear. What we're trying to avoid, of course, or what we're trying to cement is making sure that the reader is very clear and updated about where they are in the timeline. The other thing to keep in mind with that is, especially if you're having a big jump in time, is how is the character different at this point? So if you have a book, again, so if I am writing a book and the opening chapters are all taking place in the 1980s, so I'm having song references from that time period, and I'm writing about teen me. So teen me is feeling very hip and cool and into alternative music and listening to The Cure and The Smiths. I'm doing very weird things with my hair and making some poor fashion choices. And now I'm flash forwarding and I want the book to be here in 2017. I'm probably going to talk about hairstyle, fashion, music, and I'm going to try and show how am I now a different person than I was. So your character will have evolved or changed, not necessarily in a good way. They may have gone backwards. They may not be functioning as well as they were as a child. Perhaps you want to show that I was this carefree child in the 80s, and then in the early 2000s, I lost my entire family in a horrible accident, and now it's several years later, and who am I now? So you're trying to show that contrast. But the person definitely will be different. They will look different. Sadly, I can speak to that. Things don't stay where they used to in 1980 for me any longer. There's certainly fine lines, there's gray hair, there's things that are now different about me. And you're going to want to make sure that you're showing on the page that that character is also different. Now let's talk a little bit about small breaks in time. So what you can do is, unlike large breaks where I think at minimum you need a chapter break and possibly even just a break in the overall novel into a different section depending on how big the jump is. In a novel, if you're having a small jump in time, you can often do that with just creating an extra space, another piece of white space. So you'll see lines of text, a bit of white space, and then the next scene. That space is the visual cue for the writer. So as readers and as people who have read book after book after book at this point, when we get to that point in the book, we see that space and our mind automatically knows, oh, there's been some kind of change. There's been some sort of shift that's happened here. And that's usually either a shift in time, which is what we're talking about here, or a shift in point of view. So if you want to change point of view in a novel, then I'm also suggesting that you have that kind of break in space so that the reader understands, oh, a transition has happened here. Now, the same with longer transitions. If you're doing a short one, you might do some kind of reference. So if the chapter ends with, Eileen was exhausted, she pulled the blankets open and hoped tomorrow would be a better day. And then the next chapter opens with, Eileen pulled the visor down on the car window. The rising sun was directly in her eyes. The reader understands that we have made the move now from Eileen in bed the night before to the next day where Eileen's driving into work. So you can, again, provide those visual or sensory cues that allows the reader to know that we are changing time and place. What you're often trying to do with those kinds of things, of course, is skip the boring bits. So that's always that great writing advice, like take out everything that's not interesting and take out the boring parts, which sounds really easy, but isn't necessarily as easy as we think. So with this, what we are talking about is, of course, you don't need to include all the details that takes the reader from point A to point B if those details are not important. The reader will fill them in on their own. So what I often see in manuscripts for people who are starting out or sort of a little earlier in the process is they don't fully trust the reader. They don't believe that the reader will follow them. So you'll see something like, Eileen was so exhausted, she pulled up the covers. She hoped tomorrow would be another day. After 8 hours, the alarm went off. Eileen got up, brushed her teeth, took a shower, decided what to wear, decided on the black sweater, went downstairs, had granola for breakfast, talked to the dogs, recorded her happy hours, and then got in her car, pulling the visor down to block the morning sun. So all of that happened in between, not very interesting. And if you're including it just because you feel like you have to show that transition, have a little more faith in your reader. They will fill that in. It's often the same in dialogue. Readers will fill in the bits of dialogue that we don't necessarily need to include. The hi, how are you? Good. You? Yeah, you enjoying the weather? Yeah, I sure am. And you can sort of jump right into the dialogue. The reader fills it in and their brain almost makes that leap that something has happened in that space without you having to be the one to do it. So again, you're wanting to skip the transitional beats. If the story is going until I go to bed and then the next piece of action is happening when I'm driving, skip all of that in between and just provide basically that jump. The other way that you can sort of tackle some of this is what we call a montage. So for everyone who loves movies, these are the kinds of scenes where you're seeing a whole bunch of very short clipped scenes that are catching you up. So for example, and I'm dating myself to the 1980s here, for those of you who remember The Karate Kid, and this often happens, to be honest, in a lot of what do we call training montages, is you see the Karate Kid, there's a scene where he's meeting his mentor, and we understand that he's going to be trying to get better at this karate thing. And then there's a scene of him jogging. There's a scene of him sparring with his mentor. There's another scene where his mentor pushes him down. And these are happening quickly. We're talking just a few seconds on screen. So you're seeing them happen, boom, 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 boom. And then suddenly we jump and we see, for example, Mr. Miyagi suddenly bow and saying, okay, now you are finally at a level where you're ready to compete. And we, as the viewer of the movie, understand that this training took place over a long period of time and we don't need to know it. The other one you'll often see in movies is the kind of makeover montage or something that's in a romantic comedy where you see a woman who's decided, like, that's it. I'm going to change myself. And so we see a scene where she's at the gym. Then there's a quick scene where you see her getting her hair cut and they're pulling it down and highlighting and clipping it off. And then you see a scene of her holding up one outfit, and then you clip and you're clearly in another store and there's a different outfit, and then another store and another outfit and another store and shoes. And then suddenly we cut to where we see the character fully dressed with her new hair, all those kinds of things. And we understand that this took some amount of time to get to that point. That's a montage scene. And you can do that with writing as well. So for example, I have to look down because I wrote it down. Going back earlier, I was talking about if you had a character that was in a school scene. And so I want to show and sort of fast forward that the character went from where they failed an exam to where suddenly they had decided they had to get very serious. So for days, Eileen studied at the library. Days then turned into weeks. She now moved through campus like a zombie, mumbling equations to herself and ignoring the parties and the various dates. Months turned into spring, but it was worth it when she put on that graduation cap. So that's very bad. And to be honest, I wrote it about 2 minutes before this office hours started, but it was my way of trying to show really quickly where I have a character, they're now getting serious about school, and I want to montage through a very short amount or a chunk of time in a very short amount of space on the page. So the reader, without me going into tons of detail, understands that that's what the character is doing during this time period. And now I've jumped down and now it's graduation. So the scene might have opened in December. She got serious. She came back to campus. Boom, boom, boom. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Boom. It's now springtime. The reader will follow you through that montage. And that can be a way of showing that space and time continuing. So again, what you're looking to do is accomplish several things. You're looking to leave out the boring bits. So that's probably first and most important. As you're going through and you're looking at the timeline, ask yourself, why are those scenes happening in the particular order that they're happening, in the particular time frame that they're happening? Are there things that you can cut out? Are you showing more transitions that you need to? The second thing you're trying to do with the timeline is make sure that, in fact, it's clear to the reader how much time has passed. It's just important for them. If they're not aware, for example, I was reading a book recently where the character was in high school and then it flashed forward and suddenly we were in college. But because it was both still in school, it actually took me about half a page to understand that we had flashed forward into a university versus a high school setting. And it just threw me off slightly. It just took me a beat or two. Whereas the author could have swum upstream from that and placed a few things in that would have made probably a fairly big difference. So that is something that you're trying to do. And then lastly, for yourself, having an idea of where you are. And that's where a spreadsheet or a calendar can make sure you don't have inconsistencies in your book, which you're trying to avoid. So things that are supposed to be only 2 days apart that suddenly turn into days and days apart. And I've been there, so I know that one very clearly. And also for you to start thinking about, why is this taking place in the time that it is? So we do know that the more compressed a timeline is, in some ways, the faster people are reading, which doesn't mean that you can't have an extended timeline. Obviously, you can have one that spans centuries, but you have to figure out then, how do I keep that intensity up? So hopefully that answered your questions on timelines. If you have any questions, you can please put those into the happy hour section and I would be more than happy to tackle them for you. I will put a link in this description to the blank calendar sheet so you can find those if you're looking to do that. And of course, if you want to set up an Excel spreadsheet, you're on your own, but those are certainly very easy to set up. And hopefully that will keep you writing. So thanks to everyone and have a great week. Just be aware, happy hours are now switching. They will be 9 a.m. Tuesday mornings going forward. So there will not be evening happy hours. People were finding the switching back and forth challenging, that timeline shift. So we're going to keep them at 9 a.m. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Take care, everybody.